and welcome back for another lesson in AP US history. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss, and for some follow-along notes, you can go ahead and click down in the description and grab those notes so you can follow along as I go through this lesson. Today, we're talking about the Second Great Awakening, topic 4.10 in the APUSH curriculum. So our main objective today is to explain the causes of the Second Great Awakening, and this is all part of a theme about American and regional culture during the antebellum period, the years before the Civil War. So, if we look at the key concept, it's giving us four major causes that contribute to a Second Great Awakening. And these are the four things that we're going to spend the most time in this lesson. We're going to be talking about the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs, a response to rationalism, changes caused by the market revolution, and greater social and geographic mobility. So, our outline follows those causes, but also I've included just a brief slide looking at the effects of the Great Awakening, which leads right into lesson 4.11. So to start, let's look at some historical context. Things that we've talked about prior to this lesson is that we are seeing a shift from rationalism, ideas of logic, and that there is reason involved in things. That's during the Enlightenment period. We are shifting to the Romantic period, where there's a stronger focus on emotions and feelings, and we see that reflected in art. We also see, especially during the Jackson era, an increased participatory democracy. So there's a greater emphasis on equality and the common person becoming involved in society in a more important way. We see debates over slavery significantly increasing as the nation grows, both geographically and with their population. So here's a quote by Alexis de Tocqueville in his major publication, Democracy in America. In the United States, the sovereign authority is religious. There is no country in the whole world in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. So what led up to this quote is the Second Great Awakening. The rise of this religious movement is what is going to lead to the somewhat truth behind this statement. So, what is the Second Great Awakening? Well, it's a religious revival movement that swept the United States during the early decades of the 19th century, also known as the antebellum period. So, what we see happening in this Second Great Awakening is that we see a shift going from a Puritan Calvinist perspective, which believed in ideas of predestination, that some are predestined to go to heaven and some, therefore, are not, and ideas of original sin. So these can be somewhat negative perspectives, especially for people who aren't ingrained in religious tradition. And so when there is the shift to a more liberal, forgiving doctrine that becomes prominent in the Second Great Awakening, it leads to a huge increase in religious feelings, religious attitudes, and commitments. And we see a lot of young men becoming evangelical preachers, and a stronger shift to creating messages that can be easily understood by common people. And in fact, in the Second Great Awakening, we're going to see many women especially becoming really involved in churches, and also not just as church members, but sometimes also as preachers or prayer leaders. So here is a important image that kind of reflects the way that the Second Great Awakening changed the way that they were preaching, the preachers were discussing. It can sometimes be called hellfire gospel. So this is called the way of good and evil. And if you look at it really closely, you can see that there are two different paths that people can choose disobedience to parents, or they can follow obedience. And that begins them on a path to either peace or vanity and ignorance. It leads to righteousness or robbery. And one finally ends in eternal life, while the other path ends in everlasting punishment. So really focusing on some of these things that might elicit fear, talking about damnation, all of that would have been really common in the messages of the Second Great Awakening. Another really important aspect of the Second Great Awakening that you'll want to be familiar with is the idea of itinerant preachers or traveling preachers. They were also called circuit riders. And so they would use sometimes churches, but often other venues like camp meetings, meeting houses, homes, variety of ways to bring the message to people that are more isolated. So, especially the Methodist had a prescribed 2-week circuit that a minister might follow. So, they are going to go around this circuit every 2 weeks and bring their message to the people rather than having a home church and people come to them. That just wasn't going to be as effective in these isolated areas on the frontier. As I've already mentioned, they focused on a really strong emotional enthusiasm, attempting to obtain religious conversions. And we can see with the less emphasis on a physical church building that there is a transition away from this traditional formal style of worship that has characterized religion up to this point in the United States. Here's an image of a camp meeting of Methodists. So you can see that there's tents in the background, a large crowd. It's out in the wilderness, very different from the traditional church services that many were accustomed to up till this point. So, some examples of the Second Great Awakening that you might want to be familiar with. One of the first is in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, and this had thousands of people, and potentially as many as 1 out of every Kentuckians came to this 1-week-long camp meeting. What is also unique is that it wasn't just the preachers weren't just from one religious denomination, but rather Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians were all part of these sermons. They preached from a variety of places, and it was an incredibly visible response that people had to these messages, sometimes speaking in tongues, fainting, crying, very emotional responses. Another example of the Second Great Awakening that you'll want to be familiar with is the Burned Over District. This is a region in western and central New York that was called this by Minister Charles Grandison Finney. And he called this area the Burned Over District because there were so many revivals here that there were simply no more souls to awaken to the fire of spiritual conversion. So the Second Great Awakening was incredibly prominent in this New York area. So who was Charles Grandison Finney? I just mentioned him earlier, but he is probably one of the most influential preachers in the U.S. at this time. He was from the Presbyterian denomination. And while he did appeal to people's emotions and fear over damnation, he didn't do it quite as intensely as some of the other Second Great Awakening ministers. He also would use wisdom and wit to argue his case logically. He was a former lawyer, and he did definitely focus on that idea of public declarations of faith. So anti-predestination and more about salvation being available to all people. Here is a quote from one of his sermons. They understand that salvation is only through Jesus Christ. They know that they cannot be saved by works nor the general mercy of God without an atonement, and that the only way to be saved is by faith in Christ. Perhaps some of you who are here tonight are just in this case. You dare not come to Christ just as you are when you have made so few prayers and attended so few meetings and felt so little distress and done so little and been so little engaged. And so instead of going right to Christ for all you need as a poor lost sinner, throwing yourself unreservedly into his hands, you set yourself to lash your mind into more conviction and distress in order to prepare you to accept of Christ. The first act of holiness is to believe and to take hold of Christ by faith. So this passage includes a few of the main ideas of the Second Great Awakening. First, you are seeing an emotional appeal. You are seeing a evangelical message trying to obtain conversions and telling people how to do this. And you can sense a certain common language away from the higher or more difficult words that people wouldn't understand, but very directed at the audience. So let's get into the causes. One of the main ideas that you want to be familiar with is that there was a rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs. We see this through the increase in participatory democracy during Jackson, and this impacts the growth of the Second Great Awakening as well. One of the main things I think that you'll want to understand is that there is a spiritual egalitarianism. And what that means is that all souls are created equal. We think of America as being focused on equality and how that's some of our founding principles. Well, this shifts into impacting religion as well. All people can be saved, and so they should all be ministered to. It also led to some leadership requirements changing in churches. Sometimes you didn't have to be a formally trained minister. Sometimes women were allowed to participate. And so we see this idea of democracy and individualism impacting the church as well. Next up, response to rationalism. So the Enlightenment did have a belief in human goodness, and that does influence the ideas of the Second Great Awakening, but even more so, there's a reaction against rationalism. It's a kind of a backlash to these ideas of the Enlightenment period that are so focused on reason, and it's shifting to these more romantic focuses that are based on emotion and worshipers' hearts, trying to appeal to their heart versus their head. Okay, changes caused by the market revolution as well. During the market revolution, we see a lot of changes in the relationships between men and women, between social classes, as there's a greater disparity of wealth. We see changes among ethnic groups occurring because our demographics are changing so rapidly. If you look at that table on the right side of your screen, you will see that from 1820 to 1850, there is just a massive and rapid increase in immigration to the United States. All of that changes the way that our landscape is. We have bigger cities. We have an expansion to the west. We see increased roles for women. And so all of these changes are also going to be reflected in the church. Greater social and geographic mobility. As we see changes in communication and transportation, especially, we see the telegraph, we see railroads, it allowed for people to migrate to the West and also stay connected. And so word of revivals will travel quickly. And when the circuit riders, when the itinerant preachers move around, it gives opportunities for people who have moved to the West to form communities every so often under a religious purpose. Okay, so really briefly, the effects. This is going to be the absolute main concept of topic 4.11, but just to introduce it, we see church membership swelling. We see the development of new church denominations. As you can see in 1820, the rapid increase in the different denominations. We see the emergence of Black Christian churches and groups. So as we see more free Blacks being in the northern states, we see them forming their own community churches. And there is a conviction that society could look more heavenly, which led to reform movements. People are going to church and finding out that they can make society better. And so we see movements such as the movement to ban the drinking of alcohol, give women equality, to end slavery, and a variety of other movements develop in response to their convictions that they received at the Second Great Awakening, camp meetings, sermons, etc. So to end, I want to include an excerpt by Richard Allen, who was a formerly enslaved Black, showing how the Second Great Awakening influenced a group of free Blacks in Philadelphia. A number of us usually attended St. George's Church in 4th Street, and when the colored people began to get numerous in attending church, they moved us from the seats we usually sat on and placed us around the wall. And on Sabbath morning, we went to church, and the sexton stood at the door and told us to go to the gallery. About this time, our colored friends in Baltimore were treated in a similar way by the white preachers and trustees, and many of them were driven away who were disposed to seek a place of worship. Many of the colored people in other places were in a situation nearly like those of Philadelphia and Baltimore, which induced us in April 1816 to call a general meeting by way of conference. Delegates from Baltimore and other places which met those of Philadelphia and taking into consideration their grievances, and in order to secure the privileges, promote union and harmony among themselves, it was resolved that the people of Philadelphia, Baltimore, etc., should become one body under the name of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So we see this is one example of a new church developing that became very prominent in the United States. We'll continue to talk about this in lesson 4.13, I believe. So I hope that this lesson was helpful for you in really understanding the causes of the Great Awakening as well as the different aspects of it. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.